We can sort of start with your overall thoughts or impressions on The Last of Us or The Last of Us Part 2. I know that your fans obviously know how you feel, but again, if there's anybody new here that isn't familiar with your thoughts on it.
Sure. So sorry, I write notes, by the way, when I'm on podcasts. So that's why I was like scrambling around for my pen. I couldn't find it. So I consider The Last of Us at the time in 2013 when it came out to be arguably the greatest game of all time. If you can remove the barriers that, especially nostalgic barriers that would give benefit to other games on my list, a la Super Mario World, a la Mega Man 3, which is technically my favorite game ever, although I wouldn't say that's the best game of all time. When you can segment these things, I remember encountering The Last of Us Part 1 in a review environment. I was still working at IGN at the time, and it was the only 10 I ever gave a game. I reviewed hundreds of games, and it was the only 10 I ever gave out. And I always say that I would go back and probably redo most of my reviews and give out new scores to almost every game that I reviewed. And that's just the reality of the situation with years having passed, sometimes 15 years having passed. But this is the one that I would totally stand by. And I think that The Last of Us Part 2, you could argue is even better. And I was shocked by how contentious the game was. And I feel like part of its contentiousness, although I think Hoeg can talk to this more because I'm sure he has issues outside of it, but I think a lot of the contentiousness we can no doubt say began because much of the game purportedly leaked and people started putting their own spin on what they thought happened based on file names and out of context cutscenes and all of the rest. I think if anything, you could say The Last of Us Part 2 is maybe 5 hours too long. But yeah, I think it's absolutely wonderful. And the mysteries in between the folds of The Last of Us, especially with what you're talking about with order, judicial systems, vigilantism, and all those kinds of things exist in the folds in a major way. Obviously, the second one is about vigilantism, but there is a 20-year period between the end of the world and the first game, and we have no idea what happened there. We still have no idea in the lore what actually went on with Fedra, how power vacuums were filled, how justice came to be, how things disintegrated. So The Last of Us sets up this really wonderful world. And I didn't think it needed to be revisited, but when they opted to revisit it with a sequel, I feel like they now need to do a third one. And I think they will do a third one to kind of cap it all off and make it full circle. I don't know who you'll play as. I think that might drive people insane in and of itself. Maybe even we get a prequel, which would be cool. I would love a prequel. But and we can get Joel and people can stop crying about golf clubs and stuff like that.
Objection.
Yeah. So Rick, I'll throw it to you, but those are my feelings on the game. I feel like it's an incredibly impressive feat. And I was saying on the show, Rick, recently, and I don't know if you feel the same way, that I think The Last of Us, the original one, is somewhat surprising because it wasn't necessarily made by their A team. Everyone kind of folded in to do the game later, but Uncharted 3 was technically their A game. So at that time. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that I really love those games.
I think that's great. No, absolutely. And Legalbytes, I think you're going to get me fired off the Last Stand Media for Last of Us Part 2 thoughts. No, I'm kidding around. First of all, I think I don't know that I have a lot to add with respect to Part 1. I also have it as basically in my top 10. I think it's a fantastic feat of exactly what I was talking about is important to me, which is narrative and storytelling and character motivation. And the folks that made Last of Us Part 1, and I know there's a lot of overlap, but at that time, what they were aimed at, what they accomplished with that was pretty phenomenal, especially for kind of the AAA action adventure space in video games, which often looks at the question and says, okay, we got to have 4-quadrant appeal. Nathan Drake has to be wisecracking. We have to have some adventures and things like that. And for the most part, there's adventure, there's exploration. It's a road trip kind of game. The Part 1 is very much focused on not being Marvel Cinematic Universe quippy. It has moments, it has giraffes, it has these kinds of things, but it's more invested in growing a character relationship, a father-daughter type character relationship, and really all building to the finale and what that means. Now, I do have a certain amount of issue with the fact that you're playing a linear game and you don't get the choice at the end. There's nothing that you can do to advance the ball at the end. So they're telling the story they want to tell, and that involves Joel going crazy in a hospital. But even then, I like linear games. I like JRPGs because I want the developer to be able to tell the story they want to tell. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have criticisms as I do in part 2, but at the end of part 1, when you get that moment where, you know, you're talking about lying and who knows who's lying, et cetera, I thought that was just the absolutely perfect beat to end such a kind of amorphous, ambiguous world on. And I admit, in terms of Tilt, I was pretty much against a part 2 project from the get-go. In terms of, I don't see how this is going to benefit the world situation. I think you have basically a perfect masterpiece, and I didn't think it was something that made sense. Now, I will grant Colin, and I think this happens in politics and social groupings in every instance, that there are folks that hate The Last of Us Part 2 for reasons that I find to be untenable. And some of that is, hey, it got leaked. Some of that is, heck, I did a series of videos on the fact that Sony was, let's be nice, aggressively using the DMCA when those leaks happened. And I might have named that series as Sony violating the law. I can't, who can remember these things? But I did about 14 or 15 videos on, this is not what the DMCA does. You can't actually strike a tweet under the DMCA for using the word golf club. Okay, like this isn't, they were way beyond what they should have been doing at that point in time. But I deliberately didn't follow the leaks. I was interested in what this was going to be. I didn't look at any of those things. It's possible that I got, you know, memed things like golf clubs that I didn't understand because I didn't have the context. So I went in pretty blank to The Last of Us Part 2. And yes, I think there are people that are upset that Joel gets what he gets. Is this a spoiler cast? We don't have to.
Oh yeah, I should probably
this,
just say anybody watching beyond this point, there's going to be plenty of spoilers because we're going to talk about.
I don't know how we can
Last of Us Part 2.
But I wanted to before. So yeah. I think there are a lot of people that you can see online that are like, Joel was my guy, and how could they do that? And I get that. And I don't find that to be where I'm upset about this story. Where I get upset, and I think I was nodding my head pretty vociferously, is I think it has massive structural and pacing issues in terms of doubling up the game and doing things that are completely tangential to what the first half of the game is, doing it again. And then on top of that, I have pretty massive character motivation issues where, you know, when you're watching a movie, when you're watching a TV show, and you get to that point where you're like, well, I can feel that the writers need this to happen, so they're going to pull their strings. I remember this pretty vividly watching the program Lost, right? Where you have to have people that know things not say it to each other, where you have to move people into the jungle in a specific way. I felt that very, very significantly in The Last of Us Part 2, that they wanted to do this, and this, and hell or high water, they're going to move these people into position. And by the way, they're going to make you spend another 2 hours going to the next weenie off in the distance. And that didn't work for me. Now, I will also say, as part of that postmortem, this was, in my opinion, when it was released, one of the prettiest, most well-realized worlds that I had ever seen. I think the gameplay is pretty much normal. I don't see a lot that's special there. But in terms of the graphics, I thought it was absolutely amazing. So at that point in time, you've got amazing graphics. You got good vocal performances. And I think, what did I name my video? It can be for nothing. All in the service of a story that I didn't think was valuable. And that, more importantly, I thought basically treated its audience as if this was the first vengeance story they'd ever seen, and its characters in the same way. So Last of Us Part 1, I think, is absolutely genius work. I think it's fantastic. It belongs in the Hall of Fame of video games. Last of Us Part 2, I feel very differently about.